Hey everybody, welcome back to Living Electric. We got an interesting show today. We've got a couple articles we saw recently and kind of want to respond to them as EV owners, both kind of related to just, I guess, general unhappiness with some EV stuff. And you may see, obviously, if you read the news, some of the stuff is kind of negative to be like, oh, like Americans aren't liking EVs or they're having problems with home charging. But you want to give kind of a background on those couple articles?
Yeah, definitely. But before we get started, this is our 80th episode, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So happy 80th episode of Living Electric.
That's right.
Yeah. And before we get started, actually, I just wanted to give, a big shout out to everybody who's listened and support us. And if you want to continue supporting us, we do have a Patreon now, so we will include the link to that in the show notes. And any donations definitely helps us continue building the show and make it better for you guys. So
right.
Thank you for 80 strong episodes.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of growth recently, too. We've been obviously tracking all of our analytics and stuff, but like the growth as we've been kind of more consistent with episodes, I think helps. But obviously all the listener support is greatly appreciated. So Definitely,
especially as we gain listeners from all over the world, which is insane. Right. So it's exciting.
Definitely.
But yeah, so, as Alex mentioned, there's been some surveys. If you are working in the industry or if you're an EV driver or you're just interested in learning more about EVs, I'm sure you've seen these articles from, like JD Power talking about conflicted interest in home charging and satisfaction with home charging, all the way to 1/3 of Americans, don't really find EVs interested or actually, no, 1/3 of let me restart that. 1/3 of Americans are interested in EVs when they only surveyed about 4,000 people. So it's like, so some of these surveys are definitely skewed a little bit, but we definitely want to talk about that today. So today's going to be more of an opinion piece.
Yeah. I think the whether the like percentage is correct or not, it's clear there's some people out there that do think that way. So I think at least kind of honoring that argument and kind of talking through that will be valuable. So we'll get into it and kind of give our thoughts on things.
Definitely. Well, I think we should start with home charging. The survey that JD Power did in collaboration with PlugShare and their plug-in sites members, which I believe based on this article, they had about 63,000 members, but they only surveyed less than 14,000 of those members. So, we've talked a lot about home charging on our podcast, now that Alex officially has home charging, well, level 2 home charging.
Right.
And I've had home charging for a few years. Before we dive into that, are you satisfied with your home charging since we were part of the survey?
So I would say I'm kind of lukewarm on satisfaction. I think after it's all set up and I've been using it, it's been great. I love the convenience of it. I love how affordable it is. I'm sure we'll get into it, but I'm not sure how much of this survey covered, actually installing the home charging. Because I know for that for me, I would say I was disappointed with, if you will. I kind of knew what I was getting into, but I could still see somebody that maybe doesn't have my patience or understand what I was getting into. I could see where it would be, frustrating or not ideal. So
definitely. Yeah, well, they broke it down into 4 key findings, and the first one is as electricity rates increase, a lot of owners are becoming more frustrated, and they're starting to realize that education is key to helping owners become more comfortable in realizing just how expensive it will be to charge your vehicle at home. Yeah. And I'm saying expensive loosely, more of the cost of what it is.
Yeah.
The one thing to remember too is that when you're not going to a gas station anymore, you still have to pay for fuel in some aspect, right. Which is going to be now your electric bill.
Yeah.
So based on the survey, they found that more people are complaining about how much their electric bill is actually increasing from charging an electric vehicle.
Yeah.
I actually wanted to run this by you because I know last time when we hung out, you had mentioned that you've noticed that your bill has gone up slightly from charging your car at home.
Yeah.
Has that been a concern of yours since electric rates are going up?
Yeah, so our electric rates have stayed the same, with our utility, but I guess the piece that was interesting with ours is we haven't lived in the house long enough to notice is this actually higher because of our EV? Is it just higher because we're actually living here now? Because we installed, the home charging and we're charging at home around the same time we moved in. It wasn't that much time. But I've noticed you can look at like kind of the day-by-day breakdown of how many kilowatt hours your house is using, which is pretty neat, like in our utility portal. And the days we charge the car and days we don't charge the car, it's very clear to see like which days those are. Because like an average day we use like around 100 kilowatt hours, which is an insane amount of power, honestly. Like we need to make our home way more efficient.
Turn off the lights.
Yeah. But we... days we don't charge the car, we're only using 75 to 80 kilowatt hours. So like it's a clear bump up. Like that's a pretty good percentage bump up in how much energy we're using. So that piece, I could see where that can be frustrating to some people. But we also, we're in a kind of a unique case because Mallory has a really long commute. So like we're using a lot of energy just in the battery to get to work and back. We would be spending significantly more if she drove like an inefficient gas car. So yeah. I think you've also got to, with pricing in general and costs of things, you've always got to be cognizant of what you're comparing it to as well. Like if you're comparing it to a like uber efficient hybrid that's getting 50 plus miles per gallon, and then you switch to an electric vehicle, your savings probably aren't going to be a ton, quite honestly. Like if you're switching from a 30 mile per gallon car that like is pretty inefficient, then your savings are going to be a lot more. So it's I think just keeping that perspective is important.
Definitely. Yeah. And, that's actually one thing that we've noticed too, is that our electric bill has gone up slightly, that we're charging two EVs on the regular, we're not charging them frequently. I think it's similar to what you guys do. You kind of monitor and analyze your electric use. And for us, like we'll charge our Tesla maybe once or twice a week. And the Mini, obviously with its shorter range, we charge that a little bit more frequently.
Yeah.
But we have noticed a slight increase in our electricity bill. But it's the winter time, it's the colder months, you're going to be using a little bit more to keep your house warm. And yeah. But that's really where education comes in. So the next piece is that there was a unsatisfaction in terms of scheduling charging or how long charging takes. And this is obviously another educational piece. I think some new EV drivers will get into an electric vehicle and, they get level 2 charging installed at their house thinking that it's going to be faster because you see it all over the industry. This charger is 6 times, 7 times faster than, level 1 charging. And yeah, it might be, you might get 25 to 30 miles per hour of charge, but when you add like 7 times faster, people are going to be like, oh, I can charge in 1 hour or, 2 hours. And, sometimes depending on your vehicle, that's not the case. Right. And, I know for us, sometimes like we'll plug in and we'll be like, oh, we have 8 hours until this hits 80%, based on how low our state of charge might be. Right. But sometimes you just unplug, you just keep going if if you're able to. But that is one thing that fell on here as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. What we plug in every night. I like just keeping the car on the charger because we like preheat it because Mallory's like commuting. Both of you work from home, right? So it's like you're not really using your car necessarily every single day to like commute or anything like that. But with us, we plug in every day, so I can see where people maybe almost treat it like a gas car. They're like, oh, I have like a gas pump in my garage, so I'll just fill it up once a week or charge it once a week. And then you plug in, you're at 15%, and it says, 8 hours to charge. Whereas like ours, we plug it every night. It never really drops below, I think, like 65% on a typical, day. So when we plug in, it's taking, less than 3 hours generally. Like it's charged up before we go to bed most nights. So that piece I think is important to know. And I think just getting in the habit of just keeping your car plugged in is probably the best if you have a proper setup for it. So I know yours is a little weird though with it in like the middle of the driveway. So
yeah, we try our best to plug in like either when we know we're going to be home for a few hours or like overnight. That way it's not a pain to have to move the cars back and forth and so forth.
Right.
But I remember early on in my days and with like EV interest and stuff like that, the ABC always be charging. That's kind of like a lot of owners will say that, which I think is true. Like if you're out in public, you see a charger. If you don't need it, don't block it. But sometimes it's cool to check that out because I'm a nerd. But if you're at home, keep your vehicle plugged in if you need to. Obviously, you might see a spike in your electric rate or bill if you do that all the time. But just something to be mindful of. So the next point on the survey is geography makes a difference in terms of charging satisfaction with home charging. Obviously, electric rates differ depending on where your home is based at, where you live, and so forth, as well as utilities. They mentioned in the survey that a lot of people didn't realize that utilities offer different types of incentives, either for like home charging installs or maybe lower electricity rates in terms of like times of use programs, and so forth. So once again, it does kind of play into that education aspect of making sure that you're informed before you either buy an electric vehicle or get like a home charger installed.
Right. Yeah, there's a like ton of these utility programs out here because obviously it's a good thing for utilities. They want you using more energy. That's how they make money, right? So they want people using more energy. But also like having the ability for them to either control it or see data on it, like all that stuff is very valuable for utilities to be like, hey, look at all this data for all these EVs that are coming. We can then, based on the home charging usage, we can track that and say, okay, is this going to, double in the next 10 years? Is it going to triple? Like they can kind of track that out. So all that is really valuable for them, which is why they give out a lot of that incentive money. And, we've seen some utility programs where they can actually like throttle the usage or just completely turn the charger off during certain peak hours so that you're not straining the grid. So I think those are all, I wish even like every utility had a program like that, but just looking around, many of them do already. So definitely. Like I would flag that for any future EV owners is definitely like check local incentives. One thing I didn't talk about, I just filed my taxes, and you actually get up to $1,000 rebate on a home charging installation.
Yeah.
And that's a federal credit. So that's like, you can use that if you're installing new home charging. So I spent, $5,000 upgrading my charger. And I think I forget what the percentage is. I think it's like 20% or something, but it's a high end limit of $1,000. So I got like basically $1,000 credit on my taxes, which was nice. So I didn't have to pay as much.
Yeah. Yeah, especially with your situation with how much that costs.
Right.
That's great. Yeah, I think when we installed our charger, I think it was a 30% tax credit.
Okay, 30. Yeah, it's probably the same. I don't think it's changed. So
yeah. I think there was talks about, before the infrastructure bill that they passed a few months ago, I think there was talks about them removing that, so I'm glad they didn't, because that's going to really help people. I do want to give just a quick shout out to ChargeWay, because this is actually something we do in terms of like our utility program. So our ChargeWay beacons with utility partnerships across the country, we installed these beacons in showrooms, in like, dealership showrooms. And we actually have an incentives tab in the ChargeWay beacon that shows the utility program. So like it will show like home chargers that they have, discounts on, or like, maybe some type of incentive on. We provide ways for people to submit forms directly to the utility so the utility can reach back out to, the new driver to get a charger installed and so forth. So it's a big aspect of how you can make things better at home. But I think a lot of people just paid the bill and just move on with their lives. I don't really think that they think of what else is out there.
Yeah. And that's no fault on individual owners either.
No.
Like I think that's a fault on, dealerships or just local, utilities educating people about that. Like if you're not searching for this stuff, sometimes it's not going to, slap you in the face. You've almost got to be looking for it in a lot of cases, which is unfortunate. So, that's part of the reason we do this podcast is kind of getting the word out there about this stuff, things to think about, like as you're getting into more EV ownership. So
exactly. And then the last one was home charging game changers. So there was a satisfaction in terms of level 1 portable chargers to level 2 permanently mounted chargers. It definitely seems like there was a interest in permanently mounted chargers versus like portable chargers in this survey. But I always recommend do whatever works for you. If you need something that is going to be portable, for us, we wanted to make sure that our charger could be unplugged just in case if we end up moving. But we plan on just leaving it at the house. So And that's another thing too, and this wasn't part of the survey, I just want to throw this out there. I've done some research on this. There's a big interest in terms of home charging when you've done the upgrades, especially if you sell your house. There's a big interest in marking that in the listing because a lot of people want to make sure that the home is EV charged, capable,
EV
or at
ready,
least ready. Yeah, EV ready. So that could definitely help with your value. But so that was the JD Power home charging satisfaction survey. I thought it was really interesting at first when I read the title of the article through Electrek. And then as I started looking through these surveys, I'm always cautious with reading surveys because I'm an EV owner and I didn't submit any type of feedback or response through these. So it's always interesting to see these type of surveys come out, but I always kind of feel like they're a bit slighted in a way. Mm-hmm. Because, there's probably thousands of people who they've missed, who they didn't get the chance to review or leave some type of feedback that could have changed these results in a different way. But obviously that's what a survey is. So
Yeah, like I said, I think it's kind of take it with a grain of salt, but it's clear some people are thinking this way and have these issues or opinions. So I think it's valuable to talk through and kind of see where the gaps are in terms of making it a better experience for everybody. So
definitely. Yeah. I just, my mind always goes to, I hope this doesn't skew anybody's thoughts when it comes to EVs,
right.
Especially with the titles of these articles, like the next one that we're going to talk about.
Yep. I think it's always just valuable to kind of have an inquisitive mindset versus a reactionary. If you see something you disagree with or maybe looks a little weird, just be curious about it. Not necessarily immediately oh yeah, this sounds awful. At least take the time to kind of research it and dig into it a little bit more and learn more about it, because there may be some truth to it, or you may see oh well, they did do the survey properly. So yeah,
definitely, yeah. Yeah, that's a piece of mindset, or that I should be taking as well. Because when I first read these, I'm like, oh no, this is going to mess up everything with what we're doing. And then as I started, you brought up a really good point. I mean, this is all good feedback. Feedback is good feedback, regardless. So hopefully this does improve, especially as more people get into EVs.
Right.
So the next article, this one I did react to a little bit. I texted you about this.
Yeah.
Just because I dug into this and they only did a survey of around 4,000 people.
Yeah.
So I'm going to read the title of this. Not that popular. Only 34% of Americans would consider an EV as their next car.
Yep.
I'm pretty sure 4,000 people is way less than 1% of the the United States population, or the population here in the United States.
I was going to say we've got 330 some million people, so I think that's a very small iota of what the general population is. So yeah.
Yes. But I thought that this was relatively interesting, regardless of the small amount of people that Reuters surveyed nationwide for this, because it definitely does provide some insight into the demographics of who are interested in electric vehicles. We talk about the government sometimes, in this podcast, mainly towards pushing EV chargers. But I thought it was really interesting. They broke down the political parties of who are interested in EVs. Democrats consisted about 50% of that, saying that they would consider an EV, and 26% of Republicans and 27% of independents say that they would consider that. Out of those, 4,000 people, or 4,400 people that they surveyed. So I thought that was pretty interesting. I know that people don't buy EVs necessarily, for either making the environment cleaner. We all have our reasons why we want to buy an electric vehicle. So I thought that point was pretty interesting. Yeah,
it is. I'm just looking through. I think it's interesting. I'm curious what the options were too, because the way they phrase some of these, they're only 34% of Americans would consider an EV. So what were the other options here? Was it either consider or not consider, or was it maybe would consider, or was there something in the middle there that may have had more options? Because I think we've seen with a lot of other polls, it's most people are at least thinking about it. They're maybe not oh yeah, I'm set on getting an EV, but they're at least oh, I would actually potentially get an EV, or at least would shop around for an EV. So I'm curious what the other options here, if it's was just a yes or no, or was there kind of some some medium answers in there, but
definitely. Yeah, I think that's the one thing that, and this is going to be me reacting, that's the one thing that frustrates me about a lot of these articles that like kind of summarize these surveys, is that they don't provide the survey. They don't provide a way for like people to just analyze like what the questions were that were asked, and kind of like the breakdown of who answered what.
Yeah.
Unless I'm missing that, but I looked through both of these articles and I didn't see any link for the survey itself.
Yeah.
But it would be really interesting to see what kind of questions they're asking. I think that would be important. So if anybody's listening who does survey taking, keep that as, some feedback.
Right.
But another thing that I thought was interesting is that price of EVs is starting to become a consideration for people. And obviously, and I know that probably sounded stupid for me to say that, because we talk about that all the time. The cost of the cost of getting into an EV is a big factor.
Right.
And the thing is that most electric vehicles are still, around $30,000+, which is expensive. That's not exactly accessible for, some people. And the survey said that 56% of, participants said that they were not willing to pay more than $49,999, or around $50,000 for an EV, which to me I think is reasonable, because that's a very expensive vehicle.
Yeah. Which unfortunately is kind of the price of a new car today.
Yes. Yeah.
Just the way the car market has gone. But I'm hoping we'll see things kind of cool off. And I say this to a lot of people that are concerned about the price of EVs, is like, this is a brand new market. Like, if we're looking at buying an iPhone in 2009 or whatever, whenever it first came out, it was going to be expensive to buy one, and there was only like one iPhone model out. You couldn't buy like a used iPhone for half the price. So EVs are very much in a similar boat, and we've finally seen things kind of start to cool off. There's some really good used EV options out there. Like, you don't have to buy a new EV anymore to get like a decent vehicle, right? There's a lot of good options out there in the used market. So I think that's something to keep in mind as well. Totally get the the $50K range for EVs. We also see financing rates are continuing to go up, so like it's not getting any cheaper to buy a new car right now. So I think that will cool off eventually, but between economic conditions and everything else, I don't know if we'll ever see like a brand new EV that's like sub 20K. Like, I just don't think that's going to happen. It's going to continue. There'll definitely be cheaper options, but I don't think it's ever going to get like that cheap, just the way things are going. So
yeah. I feel like on average, even like the cheapest of vehicles is around 22,000. Like, I mean, I might have to do research on this. I'm sure there's a gas vehicle that's like $18,000 out there, but even that's still pricey for, some people.
Right.
But the thing you mentioned, you hit it right on the head. There was actually an article I saw from Electric the other day talking about used Model 3 prices and how they're plummeting. Which is good for the used car market for people who want to get into, a used Model 3, not necessarily good for people who want to trade in their Model 3, but it's good for people who are looking for used vehicles. And now that tax credit, if you buy an EV for under $25,000, which I think that tax credit goes into effect next year. I think that's 2024. When the used tax credit goes in. I have to double check, I'm sorry if I'm confusing anybody. That whole thing is a lot, but, that's going to make it a lot more accessible for people. I saw a Chevy Volt the other day, which would, qualify for that tax credit. It was $17,000 with like 50,000 miles. Right. So to get an extra $5,000, or I think it's $4,000 or $5,000 tax credit, that'd be a really great deal, to get into a car like that. So, I think the whole theme that I'm noticing from like our previous episodes and like through today's episode, things are going to get better. It's just everything is still being figured out. So things will just improve.
Right. Yeah. And even if you look back, like we had our local like Drive Electric leadership meeting last night, and we were talking about how much stuff has changed in such a short amount of time. Like, it's 2023 now. When I joined like the local Drive Electric group, it was 2018. Like, when I was fresh out of college, there were like 3 or 4 vehicles on the market that were decent EVs. And we're looking back, like, we're thinking about doing some more like educational material, and we're looking back and like so much of the stuff is outdated now. It's like talking about, charging, or like, what networks are out there. Like all this stuff is like completely different than it was 3 or 4 years ago, which is like such a short amount of time in the grand scheme of things. So things have changed very quickly. There's already way more options out there. I think a lot of we're seeing a lot of companies start with the more expensive vehicles too, which I think skews a lot of this, where it's like, oh, we're releasing a new EV that starts at $80K or whatever. Yeah. Especially on the startup side, right? I mean, a new Rivian is not gonna be a cheap vehicle.
No.
So
you got to start somewhere, though.
Right. So I think we'll see a lot of people still continue to start with especially new models, like start with expensive ones, but then slowly release, more affordable ones. So we've seen that with basically every car maker is they eventually start releasing more affordable models because they know they got to sell cars. So yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I think, and I've said this since day one of this podcast and since day one of like starting content, education is such an important part of EV adoption that I think the more exposure that new owners and existing owners get to, learning how things work and how, like things operate, especially, from like a home charging aspect, things will just improve. So I'm curious to see that JD Power survey next year, if they keep releasing it every single year to see how that improves. Obviously, electric rates are kind of out of your control unless you do something to produce your own electricity, via solar, wind, or like some type of home installation.
Right.
But everything else, hopefully it just gets better, which I have a feeling it's going to.
Definitely. Yeah, the other piece on this study I thought was interesting was the range question, because they asked about like what's the minimum amount of range you want on an EV, and 35% responded that they wanted 500 or more miles. And another 37% wanted a minimum of 300 miles. So I think with this one, I think it's like if you ask just a random person on the street, like how far away is 500 miles? Like I think people's perception of like how far away a mile is a little bit skewed too. Because I know, like, talking with people in the Midwest and Ohio, it's like, how many hours away is it? It's not miles. So I think a lot of people talk that way. They're like, oh, it's an hour drive or whatever. So I like to reframe those questions to be like, oh, well, like, I can drive for, 2.5 hours without stopping. And they're like, oh, well, yeah, like, that's fine. So.
Yeah. No, you brought up a really cool, like, point. Like I've seen that joke that like here in Ohio we always talk about like time instead of distance, which is so true. But it would be really interesting if like some manufacturer puts like how many hours worth of driving you have, including with like the percentage as well as like miles of range, because I think that would be a really cool aspect for people to understand. Like, hey, you might not be driving 3 consecutive hours. You might have to stop at some point, or like, try to make it a little bit more realistic. Because like we hear that all the time. Like I want like a 500-600 mile range vehicle. And it's like, how far exactly is 500 miles? Like I was trying to think of like cities that are 500 miles away. And
you probably can't say off the top of your head. Like I'm not going to, hopefully I'm not insulting your intelligence, but I don't think you can.
I mean, it's early in the morning. I'm sure I've said something dumb, but like, like Buffalo, New York, that's like, I think that's like less than 200 miles from Cleveland. So like to add an extra 300 miles on that, like
and you're like, okay, like and
that's
at that point
that's
it's like I'll be spending the night somewhere probably.
And Buffalo I think is like 2.5-3 hours away. So like like by then I'm gonna have to stop and use the bathroom. I know me, so like I'm gonna have to use the bathroom at some point. But like. Yeah, it's I think if you start looking at things a little bit more realistically and just realize how often do you drive 500 miles versus like what you could charge up throughout the week, I think people would start realizing that like, oh, that 300 mile range or 250 mile range EV would be perfect for me. So yeah, that's I think we should do a whole episode on that, just breaking down time and distance and stuff.
That would be interesting. Yeah, that's a tip Mariah gave me actually when we're talking at events and stuff, talking to people about like, oh, well, like how far can the car go without charging or without stopping? And she always responds with, instead of saying, oh, it can go X amount of miles, because like nobody really has a great frame of reference of how far that is. She'll say, oh, I can get to these 5 cities from here without stopping, which I think is a great answer. So if we're doing an event in Columbus, I can be like, I can get to Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Louisville, like all of these different places without stopping. So I think that reframes it for a lot of people to be like, oh, that's actually a lot farther than I thought, even though it might only be, 200 plus miles, not even a full 300. So I think that's helpful. And then the other thing I wanted to say is we see like how many hours of operation like on like power tools or whatever, like for a battery instead of it's not like RPMs or whatever. I don't know what the equivalent would be, but like I think it'd be interesting for car like spec sheets to start showing that like, oh, it can drive 3 hours at 70 miles per hour or something like that. That'd be interesting.
I think, they should include that in, with the charging times. Obviously, we need to have little footnotes that include, like, optimal conditions for charging times, which a lot of manufacturers don't like to include. But, like, I think that would be really cool to have that in their, like, drive time. Yeah. I think... I feel like so many people who are going from like gas to electric when they're so used to filling up in like 3 to 5 minutes and then just keep going on the road. And it's definitely a different mindset, but it really is all perspective. Like, I love that answer that Mariah gives. I'm going to start using that. It's actually funny you mentioned that because I used that yesterday in a conversation I had about our Model 3. I was asked like how far I can, drive. And I'm like, well, we went from Cleveland to Columbus and we got there with like 40% left of range. And I was going like 70 to 75 miles per hour and it was like 45 degrees. So like it wasn't exactly prime conditions to be driving, but we still got there with 40%. So like we could have kept going, as I just hit my desk, we could have kept going to almost Cincinnati without having to charge. Right. So, and I think if you really just start looking at distance and cities and stuff like that, it makes more sense that you probably don't need a 500-mile range vehicle.
And especially in your like kind of geographic area, it's like you kind of know where most people are driving. Like in Columbus, like people are probably driving up to Toledo or Cleveland or Cincinnati or maybe over to Indianapolis. Like they're probably hitting kind of these big city hubs that are all within, pretty close driving distance. Might be different in, states out west where the major cities are a little bit more spread out. And you're like, oh, well, I actually have to stop like 3 times to get to the next major city, which is a little bit different conversation. But, for a majority of people that live in cities, large cities, most of the other ones are fairly close. So
yes, yeah. Well, people like to trash talk the Midwest, but we don't have to drive very far to go places. So it only takes an hour.
Yeah, exactly.
But well, I like seeing these surveys because it is interesting in terms of like the data points. I just don't like the clickbait titles, so that's why I wanted to provide that to you. Right. but once I think it really puts a lot of these surveys into perspectives when you start looking at how many participants were actually participating in this survey. The only other piece of advice I want to give to survey takers, and I get it, you want people to read the whole article. Put that number at the beginning and not the very end. That way it kind of gives perspective for the rest of the piece. That's just my opinion.
You want them to actually present things,
I have an opinion. I never have an opinion. I don't know what you're talking about.
That's funny.
Yeah. But, so I think that's it for today's episode. Unless you have any other random surveys you know of?
No, I don't think so. I think we covered most everything. I'll give a quick plug to, I think this episode will be out before I do my stream, but this Sunday I'm going to be doing I guess this episode will be the day after my stream, so it probably won't be a ton. I'll add the link in the description though, but I'm going to be doing a live stream for, kind of reacting to similar things to this, hopefully on like there's a YouTube video that maybe walks through similar things, but I've got a couple saved that I'm going to react to on the day before this episode goes live, so I'll link it down below. But I hope to start doing those monthly where it kind of gives me like time to do like almost a personal podcast and react to some different YouTube videos, because I see so many like YouTube videos with similar kind of, titles to these articles that are just anti-EV stuff and with, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of views, and maybe aren't presenting things accurately. So I'd like to hopefully get ahead of that, at least kind of be a foil to that in a little bit.
Definitely. No, that sounds cool. Well, for I'll have to join on Wednesday and watch your live stream because I know how important it is to debunk that type of stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
So, That's cool. That's exciting.
Yep. But
Well, do you want to give a shout out to your
episode.
YouTube channel? I don't know. I mean, like, if there's like a new listener, maybe they don't know your YouTube channel.
Oh yeah, I'll link it down below. But yeah, I mean, both of us have YouTube channels, so
You're more active than I am.
I haven't posted much recently. I still got to work on my Nero video. I think I said in the last episode I'd have it out, but it's still, it's 4 days after our last podcast, and it's still not out. So hopefully it's posted by the time this episode goes live, but we'll see.
Well, I think that's it.
All right, take care, all.
We'll catch you in the next episode.